But secondly, it is that air link, because that air link does represent sort of the Falklands connection to the wider world, which is not dependent on a Royal Air Force connection via Ascension Island, which has increasingly been sort of used by a commercial operator. But nonetheless, the point is this, is that if you interfere with the relationship with Chile, you probably cause far more damage.
And on the question of Mercosur, I mean, we've seen Mercosur, the regional body, making it very difficult for shipping from the Falklands to call at ports in the region. What really is the point of bans like this? I mean, is it to increase the isolation that you're talking about? Is it to increase economic isolation, or is it political isolation, or some combination of the two?
If Argentina wants to recover the Falklands peacefully, and let's assume it does. I mean, I have no reason to think otherwise. The way that it thinks it's going to achieve that is by isolating the Falklands and making it what it sees as British occupation increasingly expensive and untenable. You know, whether we like it or not, for the Ministry of Defence, the Falklands is probably defence priority number 3 or 4. You know, that's what we're talking about. It's certainly top 5. So everything Argentina tries to do, in effect, is about isolation.
Marc Rogers, is there a sense in Argentina that the government is making the right noises? It's making the noises that it has to. It's playing to its domestic audience and saying the right things about the Malvinas. But there is quietly an acceptance that essentially the status of the Falkland Islands isn't really going to change.
Yes, I think so. You have to understand that all Argentines are educated throughout school, that they're told that the Malvinas Islands belong to Argentina. All maps produced in Argentina point out the islands as Argentine territory, and they're called Islas Malvinas. So there is a broad consensus that the islands do belong to Argentina. I think it's even in the constitution here that they belong to Argentina. But at the same time, I think most people accept, and I think there's an air of resignation that against a far stronger government, more influential country in global terms, military terms, and in global politics, there isn't really much they can do.
Ben Harris, in your view, is there any realistic prospect that the sovereignty status of the islands could change?
Now Argentina is a renewed power, they're a renewed economic power. They have some diplomatic credibility, certainly in the region, but also outside with the United States and with the United Nations more widely. And I think their goal, therefore, is to bring this issue, as Hillary Clinton actually suggested, to the negotiation table. And indeed, the fact that the United States is not interested in this issue and could perhaps be described as neutral is significant in itself, because it really leaves the two nations in an open dispute that would suggest that the only eventual conclusion is a diplomatic solution, a negotiation. And I think that would be a huge victory for Argentina if they managed to achieve such a negotiation.
I was going to ask you, can you foresee any circumstances in which the British government would enter into these kinds of negotiations?
Well, I mean, I would certainly hope not. And I think David Cameron, while he's Prime Minister, would be very reticent to engage in any negotiations of that nature. But as has been discussed, I think if nations in Latin America, such as Brazil, Chile, started to make things more awkward, more expensive for the United Kingdom and for the Falkland Islands itself, and indeed if other parties, international parties, were either making themselves neutral or indeed in support of a negotiation, then it may well force Britain to the table.
Just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig, and today I'm discussing the escalation in tensions between the UK and Argentina over the Falklands, with my guests Klaus Dodds, Ben Harris-Quinney and Marc Rogers. Klaus Dodds, really on this sort of bigger picture, can you foresee any kind of substantive negotiation between Britain and Argentina over the islands? Is Argentina's claim to the islands actually a valid one?
Well, I think the notion of valid claims is an extremely contested one, I think it'd be fair to say. I think I would simply say that what you have here, which makes it perhaps an interesting example, is there's no history of indigenous population in the Falklands. And what you have is in a sense, rival colonizing settlement kind of strategies and projects. And so I think what really probably bugs Argentina more than anything else, it comes down to the fact that the party involved is Britain, a former imperial power who is effectively, through the Falklands community, occupied, settled these islands that are only 300 miles off the Argentine coastline for 180 odd years. And I think what some Argentine friends used to say to me is, well, imagine a different kind of context where Argentine settlers were occupying the Channel Islands, which are certainly not 300 miles off the UK coastline, but you take my point. So proximity here is a very powerful factor in animating Argentine frustration, as well as the fact that it's Britain. The bottom line is Argentina thinks it has a very strong claim. Its 1994 constitution embeds that claim, and more distractingly from Britain's point of view, we also argue over the ownership of South Georgia and a vast sway of the Antarctic Peninsula and surrounding islands. I don't see any settlement in the near future for two reasons. First of all, though all those disputes I've talked about or hinted at are considered by the British to be quite legally distinct, Argentina sees them as very interconnected. So, for example, when you talk about the Falklands, you inevitably, I'm afraid, talk about other aspects of the South Atlantic and the Antarctic. And that's why a concession from Britain is extremely unlikely, because the fear is it will then be South Georgia, and then it will be the Antarctic territories. The other issue that's incredibly important, and the 30th anniversary will remind us of this, is no government, whether they're British, Labour or coalition, will want to be seen to be giving up the Falkland Islands, particularly if you bear in mind that 255 British lives were lost, as well as many more Argentine. Nobody wants to be seen as giving up these territories, because then what are you effectively saying to the relatives of the dead? You died in vain.
Marc Rogers, on the question of the recent discovery of oil, I was speaking to a journalist in the Falkland Islands yesterday who said, look, irregardless of whether or not Argentina likes it, we're here. And the oil resources are within our own jurisdiction. And so the Argentinians need to be speaking to us in order for us to be able to exploit these resources together. Is there any sense that actually practicality in the end wins out?
Not really, because I think that talk of the jurisdiction is contested by Argentina. They would say that it's within their jurisdiction, or at least some kind of joint jurisdiction. That would be a compromise. I think at the moment Argentina's position is that all natural resources around that area rightfully belongs to Argentina. I think a lot of the talk about the sovereignty of the islands boils down to the jurisdiction over these natural resources. I think obviously oil and also still the fishing industry is still an important factor here.
We're very nearly out of time, but Ben Harris, just lastly, can you envisage any cooperation in the near future between Argentina and Britain over questions like oil exploitation?
It's certainly true that Argentina can make the exploration and the exploitation of those resources very difficult. Certainly, if you can imagine a major company like BP wanted to go in and put in place a facility to extract those resources, the Mercosur blockade would make that significantly more difficult, or the Mercosur shipping ban, would make that significantly more difficult. I suppose at worst, I don't see there being any potential for a serious military conflict, but at worst there could be the imposition of a military blockade or something of that nature by Argentina, and I think that's as significant as you would see any sort of physical military conflict.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so we must leave it there, but my thanks today to my guests, Klaus Dodds, Ben Harris and Marc Rogers. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. Stay with us.